the important thing about the right to freedom of thought is it's about the right to think whatever you like inside your head. And that's where it's very different to the right to freedom of speech, which you hear a lot more about. So the right to freedom of thought is one of the rare rights in human rights law that is what's called an absolute right. So other absolute rights are like the prohibition on torture, the prohibition on slavery. And so what it really comes down to are rights that are absolutely core to human dignity. So you can see with the example, I think, of that behavioural micro-targeting, that it's not about swinging political opinion necessarily in one way or another. It's about identifying who people are, what they're likely to be thinking, and then manipulating their behaviour and their emotional state.
What's the difference between persuasion and manipulation?
It's a really big question. And the answer, I'm very sorry, I'm likely to say this a lot, is it depends. And it's complicated. I do believe that there will be a reset. I do believe that we're going through one of those very difficult periods of history. But it is about that. It's like when accountability bites into power, power doesn't like it. And you then land up with this kind of struggle.
Baseline.
The baseline is designed to create an emotional response.
I've seen things you won't believe.
More human than human.
Make you question everything.
Our guest today, Susie Alegre, international human rights lawyer, author, whose first book, Freedom to Think, was named Financial Times Book of the Year. The new book, Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, explores what happens when machines start to shape our moral and human lives. Susie's worked across the United Nations, the EU, and Amnesty International, tackling corruption, fighting for what's right, with a truly human-centric point of view. This is the challenge I have is, for me personally, is that I've always been like behind the scenes building the infrastructure that makes these services work.
Yeah.
And when you're in that, you don't really care about the socio-economic impact. You're focused on building the bricks.
Yeah.
You're laying the foundations. That's like what your focus is. AI. And then this era of cognitive computing, which essentially is seemingly trying to replicate human behaviour and psychology, I don't think you can ignore the socio impact. You have, even when you're building the foundations, you have to be cognizant of the socio-economic impact.
But I think any of it, I mean, if you look at, the Post Office Horizon scandal, the people building Horizon weren't thinking about the impact down the line. But that, I think, really flags the importance of thinking about what are the potential consequences and also the kind of the rule of law framework around what you're doing, so that if it goes wrong, what do you then do about it and how do you respond to it? And I think that is the real key, is how you is thinking outside the box and not just thinking about whether the tech works, because it's also a lot of the impacts of firstly, what happens if it goes wrong, and secondly, what happens if it goes right.
The Post Office one's really interesting because the default was to trust the machine over the human.
Yeah, which was also a legal requirement.
And when I look at that whole situation, which is horrific, is that the human was by default seen to be the malicious, fraudulent participant.
Yeah.
Because computer said something else. That's hugely problematic.
It is. I mean, and I think that is being changed and being looked at, that kind of presumption that the computer is correct unless proved otherwise. I mean, that is, when you think about it, the idea not only that people, were wrongly convicted, but that they were convicted of crimes that never happened. But the crimes didn't exist.
Agree. But this is the issue. Once that shame was the financial impact on this was significant. One of the more important and less talked about impacts, I believe, was the shame within the community.
Yeah.
And not only did you impact these people financially, incorrectly, but they had thrived. Their very identity was to be a trusted component of the infrastructure of community.
Yeah.
The post office was a place that you would trust. Think of all the different factors of trust that were required. Their very identity was destroyed, those people.
Yeah.
And there's no amount of insurance that will ever fix that.
No.
Because the old human classic, if the world where there's smoke, there's a fire. Well, there was a lot of smoke, but there was never a fire.
Yeah.
And, people trusted in this machine that was wrong. I mean, that is a playbook for so many potential dystopian outcomes of AI's application across humanity in the next few years.
It is, but I think also it's a real signal of why, human rights matter to all of us. When you think about it, when you think about the sub-postmasters and the miscarriages of justice that happened against them, people often say, well, human rights are just for criminals and foreigners. You don't need it if you've done nothing wrong. Well, if you're a sub-postmaster, you definitely needed a solid defence lawyer. You needed a court system that works. You needed lawyers and laws that functioned to protect your rights. Nobody really knows that until they find themselves facing the state, facing justice in a situation where, it was probably the biggest miscarriage of justice that we've ever seen in this country. Just of, ordinary people, as you say, at the heart of the community, that was facilitated by non-functioning tech and non-functioning legal parameters that meant that the tech was believed over the people, even when, there was no money missing. It wasn't there.
Have we passed the point where humans are now subservient to the machine in terms of perceived value and trust?
No, I think the post office scandal will result in a sea change in the law around sort of accountability and how you think about technology and whether or not you believe it works. And if you think about it, 20 years ago, there was more of a presumption, I suppose, that, that computers worked. Now, I don't know how many people are going to always assume that the computer's got it right. We've seen, comedy sketch shows about computer says no. The more it happens to people, to everybody, because it will happen to everybody.
The irony of what's happening is the post office system was a deterministic system. It was an accounting system that was just broken or wrong, as I understand. AI and chatbots and generative AI and all of these AI agent technologies that are going to be already deployed throughout government, defence, relationships, services, they are openly non-deterministic systems. So they are not predictable in the way they behave. They are more human in their unpredictability by the nature of the technology. But we're rushing into this non-deterministic services system where the outcomes by their very nature are going to be on a spectrum.
They are, but my prediction is that in a couple of years we're going to see a lot less of this stuff being rolled out, in part because of legal accountability. I don't know if you saw, there was a Canadian case, I think it was, I can't remember if it was an airline or a car, anyway, a company that had a chatbot that was engaging with a customer, and the chatbot committed to some absolutely ridiculous discount reduction, and the customer went away and then relied on what the chatbot had said. And the company said, oh, no, sorry, that's rubbish. Our chatbot got it completely wrong. But the court said, well, unfortunately, your chatbot was acting on your behalf and you're contractually obliged to honour what the chatbot said. So it won't take very long before, many companies in many different domains find that their chatbot has gone rogue in ways that will cost them a lot of money. And therefore, any potential financial productivity benefits that they might think they're getting out of having the chatbot over having a person who's been trained, who has skin in the game, who has a degree of accountability, I think is going to be completely lost. So I think, there will be a financial incentive. And it's not about new regulation. It's just about, basic contractual liability. If you put a totally unpredictable chatbot out there to engage with the public on your behalf, you can expect things to go wrong.
So can I just clarify? You believe that we're in this hype cycle of overinflated expectations of generative AI technology, that over the coming year, 2, 3 years, we're going to see some quite hard realities about putting too much faith and trust in these generative AI language models, and there'll be a rectification or a realignment of what we expect from them. Is that how you would?
Completely. I think we're absolutely in the bubble, and I don't know if you saw, there was the headline in the FT weekend this weekend about, I think it's 1.2 trillion knocked off the value of AI companies in a sort of, there's definitely a market swing, which may be because of people not taking it up as much as they were. So we've kind of gone through everyone saying, well, this is the future, it's inevitable, you've got to put AI into your business, to then finding out that actually what's the point in many cases? It's costing money. What exactly is it doing that's of any real benefit to anyone? So there are situations where AI will be of massive benefit, but they're not most of those, in-house productivity tools or whatever. A lot of that will turn out to not be really very useful, probably will malfunction. But the external malfunctioning, the external problems will be where you will start seeing the law kick in. And that is when the financial incentives, as I say, of putting AI into your systems, of having external chatbots, because then you don't have to pay a call center, will be counterbalanced with, your legal fees for fighting the claims or paying out on contracts that were absolutely not in your interests. So I think we'll start to see more of a realistic approach to where it's useful to have AI in your systems, and that's not everywhere.
Well, what's the route back? Because I whether it's businesses closing down call centres, to your point, whether it's people using generative AI to support them in their work, social relationships, dynamics, they're investing in a new dynamic of digital assistant, of AI agent, of co-pilot, which are a lot of the terms that are kind of bandied around in corporations. Say you're 18 months into that investment and you've emaciated your human call center, your development team, because you're vibe coding, in terms of relationships, which I know is covered in some of your books. You've invested into these AI co-pilots. How do you re-engage with human relationships, business relationships, human-centered capital within organizations? Is there a route back?
I think there is. I think that it's a big challenge, and I think there will be a massive reset. So my prediction is in the next couple of years, you're going to see a massive reset, which will come from actually just having to step away. And I mean, in many areas, all those people that have been laid off are probably still looking for jobs. So you'll be hiring them back, is what I would suggest. But I mean, you see it, for example, in the justice system. There's lots of talk about how, AI is going to supercharge productivity in the justice system. And it's like, actually, the reason we have backlogs in courts is because people are not being paid. But it is this idea that, AI is going to solve everything. Whereas actually, the issue is you need to sometimes just pay the people. You have to fix the infrastructure. So, AI that could identify where you're going to have to replace the roofs on courts around the country, that would be brilliant. AI that's somehow going to replace advocacy or replace, judicial reasoning, that is not going to work. So it's about understanding what the real root problems are and where the money needs to go to solve those and where AI might help with those. And frankly, it is in the justice system. A lot of it is just about the infrastructure. It's about literally roofs leaking and therefore the courts not being available to use. And as I say, AI might be able to solve that in terms of identifying infrastructure issues. The important thing about the right to freedom of thought is it's about the right to think whatever you like inside your head. And that's where it's very different to the right to freedom of speech, which you hear a lot more about, perhaps, by definition. So the right to freedom of thought is one of the rare rights in human rights law that is what's called an absolute right. So other absolute rights are like the prohibition on torture, the prohibition on slavery. And so what it really comes down to are rights that are absolutely core to human dignity. I think human dignity is really at the core of what are called absolute rights. Whereas most rights, like the right to private life, privacy, right to freedom of speech, are limited rights, which means you have the right, but as soon as your exercise of those rights tramples on somebody else's rights, for example, then it's limited. So you can say what you like, but if what you're saying incites violence, you lose the protection of the right to freedom of speech because you're destroying the rights of others. Whereas what you think without acting on it or saying it is protected absolutely. So you can think hateful thoughts, but as soon as you start saying them in ways that impact other people, then you have these legal limitations. So yes, you can think absolutely whatever you like inside your head. And I think that is where, for me, the right to freedom of thought was really interesting, because it's not in this kind of culture wars free speech zone. It really is absolute. That doesn't mean that I agree with you, and it doesn't mean that you get carte blanche to say everything you think. But is this kind of question of, well, Susie Alegre thinks it's great to have freedom of thought as long as you think like she does. That isn't correct. And it's one of the things that I've struggled with the people who talk about tech for good, or people who talk about, using social media in ways that will, manipulate people to be better citizens. It's like, actually, if what you're doing is manipulation, then you've crossed over that line into what you're not allowed to do in terms of the absolute protection of the right to freedom of thought. If what you're doing is persuasion, if what you're doing is sort of managing the way people behave so that we can all live together in a society that, allows us all to thrive, then great. But if what you're doing is manipulating people in that way, then that's not okay. And that's something that I think is quite interesting. I don't know if you've read Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. Mm-hmm. I read it when I was researching the book, and that's about this sort of idea where people are being manipulated to basically be, extremely happy and, having state-sanctioned orgies every weekend, and it's all lovely, except that it's not, if you see what I mean. So it doesn't matter what you think inside your head. The key is the protection of that and sort of how you got there. And from a legal perspective, the right to freedom of thought has these three planks. And this is the right to freedom of thought, as I say, inside your head, not how you act on it, what you say. The first one is the right to keep your thoughts private. So if your thoughts might amount to something that in the world or country, place that you're living, would either be subject to serious social censure or might be illegal, then you can see that it's really important that you can keep those thoughts private. So one of the examples that I used in the book was witchcraft. So, if you're sitting as a middle-aged lady on your own with your cat in your cottage in a village somewhere in the 17th century, and the Witchfinder General comes to town and takes a pick at you, it doesn't actually matter whether you've ever had a witchy thought in your life. They are going to take inferences from your cat, the wart on your nose, the fact that your neighbours think you're weird, and you're probably going to be burned at the stake, regardless of whether there was ever anything going on inside your head about being a witch. And the importance of that, from the right to keep your thoughts private, was that the drafters of the International Human Rights Law framework recognised that inferences about what you're thinking, which is what effectively data does in today's world, can as much be a violation of your right to freedom of thought when you're punished for those inferences as actually getting it right. So they don't need to necessarily go inside your head and understand exactly what's happening. If they're making inferences about what's going on inside your head, so not what you're doing, just what's going on inside your head, and using that to punish you in some way, then that is going to be a violation of your right to freedom of thought. When I read about this idea of behavioural micro-targeting, particularly in a political context, this idea that a company would sell services whereby they said they can look at your social media profiles and on a fairly small number of data points, work out what kind of person you are, what your political persuasion is likely to be, what your emotional buttons are likely to be, and to use all of that information to then go back in and massage your same social media feed to make you feel differently or think differently so that you will then behave differently in the voting booth. To me, that was just, this is not about data protection. This is not about election regulation. This is about the right to freedom of thought. And one of the things I think was missed in the discussions around Cambridge Analytica, there was often it didn't work. It doesn't really matter if it works. As I said with the witchcraft example, it doesn't matter if it works. The question of whether or not it's legitimate to sell services to manipulate the population in an election context, that is the point. Where are the legal enforcement mechanisms to stop that happening? But also another part of the discussion was, they're not going to change someone if you look at it in the context of the Brexit referendum, for example. It's not about changing the way someone will vote. It's about identifying the way you think someone's likely to vote. It's all right, I think this person's likely to vote Remain. We don't want them then to get up off the sofa and go and vote. It's about voter suppression. So, what's going to make this person not get off the sofa? Either we tell them that, it's a done deal, Remain is definitely going to win, so their vote doesn't really matter and it's raining outside, so let's forget it. Or we're just going to give them a load of cat videos because then they'll be distracted and they'll lose track of time and they won't bother to go, and they'll have this warm, fuzzy feeling that everything's great and it'll all be fine. So you can see with the example, I think, of that behavioural micro-targeting, that it's not about swinging political opinion necessarily in one way or another. It's about identifying who people are, what they're likely to be thinking, and then manipulating their behaviour and their emotional state.
What's the difference between persuasion and manipulation?
It's a really big question. And the answer, I'm very sorry, I'm likely to say this a lot, is it depends. And it's complicated. I've found...
Because it's very complicated.
It is very complicated.
Because leadership, like building the pyramids or leading a team into battle, or, relies on persuasion to align a team to a common set of goals.
Yeah, completely. And I'm a barrister. That's my job, is to persuade people of the rightness of my argument.
But intelligent persuasion invariably involves orchestrating a structured way of changing the way someone thinks or behaves. And if that's somehow incentivized by something, then how is that not a degree of manipulation? So, where does media... How does it traverse the boundary of persuasion and manipulation?
It's a big question, and again, it depends. And one of the things I looked at in Freedom to Think was the Nazi propaganda machine, but also the former, sort of British Empire propaganda machine. So, state propaganda has a very long history. One of the things that I think has really changed in the last 20 years with social media in particular, and also just the scale of access to our personal data, is that everything is personalised. So as I said earlier, this right to keep your thoughts private is key to a protection from manipulation. Because once people know or think they know what you're thinking, how you're feeling, they can absolutely then tailor what you are receiving to make you behave in a different way. So it's that personalisation, which I think is the really big shift in the 21st century over into manipulation. And we're starting to see it in data protection case laws. So there was a judgment earlier this year about online gambling, where you can see the sort of the legitimacy of use of data can often depend on the vulnerability of a person. So using someone's data to identify their vulnerability and then bombard them with advertising or bombarding them with nudges towards a particular way, that's manipulation. And the question, when I say it depends, I'm not just being facetious. It does depend. It's going to depend very much on specific circumstances. It's going to depend on the way the persuasion was carried out. But when you're doing it to somebody, somebody has a tendency towards a gambling addiction, and you know what time of day they're feeling sad, what time of day they need a hit, and you can go in a really targeted way and bombard them so that they are then going to lose huge amounts of money.
Those algorithms dehumanize the target, because they will know they've probably got a KPI of dollars per hour spent.
Yeah.
And there'll be periods of the time where they can maximize dollars per hour due to a number of human factors.
Yeah.
How is that possibly regulated at that level of nuance?
Well, I think that this is the problem. I think we do have regulation. What we don't necessarily have, and what we perhaps need, is really strong regulators. And one of the issues that I've seen, certainly in this country in recent years, is the de-resourcing, if you like, of regulators. So if you look at something like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Equality and Human Rights Commission is the regulator for both the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act. Well, back in the 2000s when it was set up, it was really heavily resourced. It was, all singing, all dancing. It was able to take strong decisions as a regulator. Today, its resources over the past 15 years or so have been absolutely slashed, which then means it's very difficult. They potentially have regulatory powers to go in and look at companies and companies' compliance with the Equality Act. Well, often targeting is going to be discriminatory. There will be many ways in which that kind of technique is being used in a way which would probably be contrary to the Equality Act. But if you've got a regulator that's not really strongly funded, they're not, how many investigations are they going to be able to do? How big are those investigations going to be able to be? How complex are they going to be able to be? And so what I think you often find in this discussion about we need new regulation, often that is a distraction. What you need is to fund existing regulators or allow access to justice on the basis of existing legislation so that you can see how it actually applies to what's happening. So in many, many cases, there are specific areas where, yes, new laws will be useful, but they're often really discrete points rather than overall, particularly when you're looking at it from a human rights perspective or an equality perspective. What you need is enforcement. And if you look at the ways to bring cases, for example, in England and Wales, it's extremely costly to go to court in England and Wales. So for an individual, bringing any of these cases is quite simply not realistic in general. And so that means we don't often know how the law applies.
The international law that should be creating safe, equitable, environments for people to live and grow their families and have a degree of enjoyment in their life. Why are those countries not being prosecuted to create safe havens that people don't want to run from?
Honestly, the International Criminal Court was set up in...
Do you see the issue?
Yeah, but the International Criminal Court was set up with that in mind. Unfortunately, the international framework has been being chipped away at, and it's something that, I talked about in Freedom to Think, was this backlash against human rights. So what we saw in the 1990s and the early 2000s was this great hope, both domestically but also internationally, that we were, achieving this great hope, potentially moving in the right direction. That today in 2025 is seriously imperiled, in part because turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So when you see big powerful countries being accused potentially in these forums, well, they don't like it, so then you criticize the forum. It's one of the big challenges of accountability, that if accountability starts to work to hold power to account, the powerful don't like it. That's one of the really, really big challenges. And we are going through a massive overturning of the achievements of the last 50 years of the 20th century for peace, for prosperity, everywhere in the world. It wasn't perfect, but for many of us, our lives are immeasurably better than they would have been in 1945. I said, myself included, I wouldn't be able to do most of the work that I do if I had been sitting here in 1945. I do believe that there will be a reset. I do believe that we're going through one of those very difficult periods of history, but it is about that. It's like when accountability bites into power, power doesn't like it. And you then land up with this kind of struggle.
How will that reset manifest itself?
I don't know exactly. I hope, one of the things that actually in the last couple of years has really brought me joy is talking to sixth formers about human rights, about technology, about justice, about the rule of law. Similarly, I think things like, the internet, to talk about something big, the internet started off, everybody was very hopeful, access to information. Now it's almost impossible to find information objectively and independently on the internet because it's all curated. AI has certainly totally shifted the viability of any information either being posted on the internet and or being accessed by people on the internet. I think there will be in the next 5 years a complete change of what online means. I think the internet as we've known it for the last 25 years is in its last days. What comes next, I think, is really exciting. I would love to be part of talking to the people who have those positive images in the future, because it's one of the things that is, it's a real challenge talking about human rights and technology, because you always feel like you're raining on everyone's parade. So I've done countless webinars, but even, the conversation you have before you go into the webinar is probably much more guarded than any conversation I might have if I met a colleague, at a conference before going onto a panel or, in a cafe. It's a completely different thing. If I know that this is being recorded, which, by definition, if I'm doing it through a laptop, it is going to be recorded or capable of being recorded. It makes me much more guarded in what I say. It sort of breaks down that personal connection. But on the other side, what social media has done is give us the impression, that parasocial aspect where, the people who succeed, if you like, on social media are breaking down these barriers so everyone thinks they're their friend. They then land up potentially with the consequences that everyone thinks they're friend, but actually they're not their friend. They don't really know them. And you can land up with some really sort of serious consequences arising out of that, online stalking tipping over then into the real world. And that, so there's a real tension with our online lives between, on the one hand, this feeling of being guarded so you don't build interpersonal relationships in the same way as you do in real life. And on the other hand, having to sort of promote an unguarded persona where you're spilling out aspects of your private life to people who you don't know. You've got no idea where that's going. And that, I think, creates a really sort of, toxic and problematic environment in many, many different ways. So I do think it is. I mean, it really is step away from the online environment. Go and join a club, go and talk to individuals. That is how you create safe spaces. That is how you create communities.
You believe we should return. I mean, COVID was an accelerant for physical isolation and digital connectivity. This idea of resetting post-COVID back to in-person. I mean, look at the nature of the workplace now. I mean, it's online, it's digital. And I've seen the emergence, certainly in the last few months, of passive AI agent recording every online conversation now.
It's going to be a very different kind of conversation to the kind of conversations I would have with people that I know and meet in real life. And I think that is a real shame, because it does isolate people. And it's, talking about the AI aspect of particularly the kind of the chatbot engagement with chatbots, and particularly the relationship bots. I think what we're seeing is the next stage of what started 20 years ago, of what I call the corporate capture of human connection. So it's effectively channeling everything through a business model, all of our interactions, all of our personal lives, the way we find partners, the way, or now we don't need partners, you can just have an AI boyfriend or girlfriend and not even bother at all with trying to connect with a person in any shape or form. All of that is business. And I think people don't realise that. And there's this idea of, well, you can be much freer because you're not having to deal with human judgment. Well, human judgment is part of building communities. It's part of having a reasonable society that works for everyone. And, when you think about in the human context, in recent years, we've seen a criminalisation of coercive control in a relationship. For human society to work, we have to be able to deal with human judgment. You have to be able to deal with the fact that you might think something and say something that I radically disagree with. The irony is that in the online world, people sort of believe that they're somehow anonymous and that they'll say things on a social media platform that they would never say to your face. But actually, the social media platform, from a legal perspective, is much riskier than saying something to someone in the pub because it's recorded, it's there, suddenly has, it's publishing, it's putting things out into a wider domain in ways that can cause much more serious harm than just, you and I having a disagreement, which may be in terms that, either of us finds offensive. But that doesn't really matter. But as soon as you start doing it in a way online that then, builds up a sort of troll community, then you're in totally different levels of consequences. So the irony of this sense of anonymity online is that actually, you're absolutely not anonymous online, and the consequences of what you say online are likely to be much, much bigger than the consequences of what you might say in a one-to-one or even in a small group setting.
Do you see any positive impact on culture and civilization to the increased adoption of technology and automation?
There will be really interesting improvements, but they'll be in the really niche areas. So I think one of the ones that I looked at in the book was using AI to decode I think it was a papyrus, or an ancient scroll that could not be read by the naked eye or by any tools we had before, using AI to discover what people had written millennia ago. That, I think, is a really fascinating thing. And certainly, in history and archaeology, we're seeing really fascinating discoveries that are facilitated by technology, things that we couldn't have done years and years ago. There will be, as I mentioned earlier, using technology to identify where the problems are, I think is absolutely what we need. I saw some research, which I thought was fascinating, actually, going back to that, how we need to go, get offline and go out and talk to each other, was using AI to look at public spaces and footage of the public spaces from, I think it was from the 1970s through to the present day, and seeing how that made people interact. So how in those public spaces, the design of the public space affected whether people were able to stop and chat in pairs or in groups, or whether they were just, pushing on through with their earphones in, staring at their phones. And that AI interpretation of the movement of people in public spaces was then being used to design public spaces to foment connection between people, to design the spaces so that they will work for people to actually just sit down and talk to each other. And I thought that is brilliant, using AI in ways to interpret the world to make it better for us to operate without AI. That is what I think, where I think it could offer real benefits. But, there's no money in that.
Where the money seems to be is productivity to replace human capital. And the rise of the digital human, call center AI agents, we're also seeing the huge news and investment in humanoid robots, which are going to be a new form factor to encapsulate this. I have to say,
with humanoid robots, I kind of think I really don't understand why robots need to be humanoid. We need technology to help us, or things that our humanoid form is not very good at. So why replicate a humanoid form for those, particularly physical tasks? And it's one of the things I looked at in relation to care and technology was, there's been a lot of push, particularly in countries like Japan, about, care robots, that we want robots that are going to, replace human carers. Care is one of those really fundamentally human things where, the idea of looking after each other is fundamentally human, that kind of spirit of brotherhood, the idea of human touch, the idea of engaging. And I remember talking to a technologist who was developing technology that, he said was designed to create something that then people, for example, with dementia would be able to communicate with this robot, and that it would, respond emotionally to their emotions. And what he was describing, I said, well, isn't that just a dog? Mm. And he said, well, yes, but dogs poo. It's like, do we really need to reinvent the dog? And I think that's a really big question of how you think about what technology do we want, what technology is useful, not what's shiny and flashy and is going to look good on TV or on marketing, but, what do we actually use? And so from a care perspective, one of the things that I think is really interesting is technology that, for example, like exoskeletons for human carers, so that they are better able to safely carry out the very heavy physical tasks that can be involved in caring. So you're not taking the human out of the loop, you're strengthening the human instead of, creating a humanoid robot. So I think one of the things that would really be helpful in terms of technological innovation is thinking outside the box, not thinking the sci-fi. And often we look at the sci-fi novels, the sci-fi movies for ideas for the future. Most of those were designed as dystopian warnings, but we're taking the warnings and using them to fulfill that destiny. We really need to sort of stop, take stock, step back and actually think, all right, yeah, absolutely, technology is a huge part of our future, but which parts do we want it for? Do we really want it to be looking after us in our old age instead of helping people? And many people who, want to be able to care, want to be able to do fulfilling jobs. How do we instead make sure that they're paid well enough to do the job properly and use technology to support them? And what they found in Japan, having put huge amounts of money into care robots, was that often those care robots having been deployed, were actually sitting in a cupboard.
There seems to be an inevitable push towards some convergence of human and machine. The machine is increasingly becoming human form, not only the fact that it can pass the Turing test, but also in the form of humanoid physical nature. And many humans are becoming increasingly machine-like in their nervousness around surveillance and the way they interact. Is it inevitable that at some point human and machine are going to come together? And how is that possibly going to be handled legally, socially, economically?
I don't think it is inevitable, but I suspect that we will see pockets of that happening, communities where that happens, because obviously there are communities where there's a huge desire for that and there's huge amounts of money in it. But again, go back and read Brave New World. That's what Huxley's all about, is this, sort of technologically manipulated consumerist society. But then there's the wilds. And one of the things, being an islander myself, that I loved about Brave New World and reading it again was that, the people who resisted all of this fun and consumerism, the intellectuals, if you like, they were sent off to island communities. And I loved that, the idea that islands are going to be hubs for all the grumpy intellectuals who are fighting against this and creating art and really not wanting to be subsumed into the machine. So I think we will see, different communities taking different approaches. I think from a human rights perspective, one of the really important questions is choice. And so that is, I think, about this transhumanist idea. And I did some work for UNICEF on neurotechnology and children's rights. And, neurotechnology is a classic example of this, where, you can see huge promise for dealing with debilitative illnesses. So, you can see neurotechnology is already being deployed with incredible effect to deal with things like epilepsy. Well, that's a huge benefit to the people suffering from these illnesses, and also a huge benefit to society, that they are able to then, participate in society better than they might have been able to before, and live their lives to the full and thrive. It's fantastic. However, you then look at the idea that we might be moving into territory where neurotechnology could be used for intellectual augmentation, for example, and where you might then land up in a situation where people are, particularly if you're talking about children, where they may not have a choice about whether they want to be augmented or not, and where you don't really know what the social, emotional, psychological consequences of intellectual augmentation might be, because almost, by definition, you're not going to know until it starts. And so that then brings up real questions about freedom of choice and what humanity is. And you'll find, some people saying, well, surely everyone wants to be intellectually augmented. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And, we can see it now with the trend on, plastic surgery, and, the way plastic surgery is so prevalent today in ways that it wasn't when we were growing up. Well, you can imagine when you start looking at neurotechnology used for intellectual augmentation, what's that going to do? But what that actually then means in real terms about how happy we all are, how our societies function, I think is very far from clear. So maintaining freedom of choice in terms of how we use technology, both as a society but as individuals, I think is really important. And we're seeing it, at the moment as well in, cashless society and the drive towards the cashless society, and it being increasingly difficult to pay anything with cash. But then when you look at something like the CrowdStrike outage, where suddenly we've got 24 hours where nothing works. If you're in a cashless society, you are a hostage to a power outage situation where suddenly you can't buy anything, nobody can sell anything.
But what I see this as is the incremental evolving of normality. You're, deeply in this space from a very human-centered perspective, and you've written 2 amazing books, which I've enjoyed both and learned a lot from both, and I would recommend everybody read both books because I think they're extremely important texts on sharing knowledge about the reality of the world and the potential outcomes of pursuing over overconsumption of technology in a human form factor. Do you believe AI is going to take us to a utopia or dystopia?
It's complicated and it depends. My view is that we are about to see a big reset, and that reset is an opportunity to think about what a human utopia is, with technology as a grounding for that, but not a tech utopia. So I hope that we will see a reset where effectively, I think it's quite likely that at some point we're going to see the lights go out and we're going to have to rethink what technology is good for us. So I am a utopian in that I believe in human rights, I believe in the rule of law, and I believe in humanity. And I think that reset is going to happen, and we're then going to have an opportunity to design the technological future that we want and that is good for as many people as possible.
We are in a computer game.